with their Air Force, can you help us get surface-to-air missiles? And we would also like a $100 million loan, which we would be able to repay over a period of 5 years. So sort of a gap in the communications. And then about a year later, they write a hand-delivered note to Daniel Ortega saying, "Dear compañero Daniel, God bless the revolution. We're trying to get the stuff out of the Libyans, and the $100 million we asked for them, we need surface-to-air missiles. The Libyans said that the person we should contact is Daniel Ortega because he handles all the Libyan interests in Latin America. So we're approaching you, compañero Daniel, to ask you for your help and solidarity and helping us realize this great goal." So what I think you have, and like I said initially, it's striking that you have a populist, essentially socialist government in Venezuela has nothing in common with the theocratic regime in Iran, making common cause over the only thing they have in common, which is an intense hatred for the United States. And I think if you look at the relationship through that lens, that's the only conclusion you can come to. And then if you factor in the other parts that are floating around out there, from the FARC to the MIR to the Coordinadora to Ortega, and I think you can't leave out the possibility that if the FMLN wins in El Salvador, one of the leaders of the Communist Party there is intimately talked about in the Reyes documents about how he's helping the FARC acquire surface-to-air missiles again, working through Australians, etc. He's now a member of the Central American Parliament, so he has immunity. And like I said, I'm not concerned about the FMLN writ large. I am deeply concerned about the Communist Party, which exercises an inordinate influence within the FMLN because it gets Chavez's money for the election campaign. And once you have that, if the FMLN wins, you'll immediately see the Iranians in, I think, fairly large force again in El Salvador. And I think what there was, if you look at where they're going, the only things that you can document that they actually follow through on of their billions of dollars in promises, and in Nicaragua, I think 90% of them you can't follow through on. And it's interesting because the same types of projects are promised virtually every year, so one can assume probably they're promising the same project every year. We're trying to get some funding to go and have people actually go to the physical sites and see what the actual status is of these things. But they do follow through on the promises of diplomatic training. They do move the people out, and they do follow through on their hydrocarbon and fuel things, and they do extract always the promise and public support for their nuclear program. And I think that if you look across the region, the groups we're talking about historically that remain are not particularly benign. And I think if you look at, in my mind, in my experience, both with Al Qaeda, Hezbollah in West Africa, particularly where you have, and it's in one of the books I read, I saw in the Democratic Republic of Congo Israeli diamond dealers selling diamonds to a known Hezbollah guy, knowing he was Hezbollah, and I documented the sale of large amounts of weapons to a Hezbollah operative through an Israeli retired military officer in Panama. These lines that we think exist where these groups won't go, we think, oh, well, Iran's a theocracy. It's Hezbollah, they're religiously motivated, they won't deal with anybody else. Bullshit. They will deal with whoever they need to deal with at whatever given time for them to acquire what they want, as will the other groups who deal with them. And the idea that somehow someone won't deal with Hezbollah because they're Hezbollah and they don't like their theology is, I think, also essentially horseshit. Because you can document across numerous times and numerous continents where this is simply not true, where people of opposing views will do business together if it's mutually convenient to them, regardless of ideology or theology. I'll just close by saying I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine in Venezuela who said that I didn't have to worry anymore about the Iranians in Venezuela, and that the problem would soon be resolved. And I said, how can that be? And he said, well, here's what happens. And that he had been in the Chavez government. He said, every time the Iranians come, not only do they ask all the women to leave the office building, and they have to leave the entire building. And Venezuela has women at very high levels of government in every ministry. So all the women have to leave the entire office, which Chavez, as the champion of women's rights, is allowing to happen. He said the women are going to kick their ass. Don't worry. The Iranians won't be there long. The women will revolt. So maybe there's hope in that. And I'll end there.
Thank you very, very much. Excellent talk. We'll take this time for questions, and just raise your hand, and I think the room is small enough, and please identify yourself prior to asking your question. John.
John, I heard recently somewhat authoritative sounding that once oil hit $70, $65 a barrel, it would drain the swamps of Venezuela, Iran, and Russia.
Well, I think that Chavez's budget is premised on oil not falling below $90 a barrel. So I think that at below 90, he's having to make some very difficult choices about whether he is going to continue to screw his own country or have to cut back on his commitments to other countries. And I think that I don't entirely agree with what Mr. Gaffney said in the opening. I don't think presidents like Michel in Chile are on board with Chavez. I think they haven't found a way to confront him yet, but I don't think, despite the fact that she's an elected socialist president, that she has any particular truck with Chavez. So I think that he will see his ability to push his agenda forward, I think, yes, greatly reduced. And I think you're already seeing it in the fact that Evo Morales in Bolivia had to reach a rather interesting compromise to resolve his political crisis there, which gave a lot back to the opposition in ways that his base was very unhappy with. And I think that's in part because because Chavez had to tell him, look, we can't be here. The other thing I think where he'll retain his influence, and I don't think, because it's not a costly endeavor, is if you look at the countries in Venezuela, if you look at Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, particularly Bolivia and Nicaragua, the Iranian presence of the intelligence services is very high, and I think that they'll maintain their influence in very tangible ways that are not expensive to do. But I do think that his grandiose plans he's promised $43 billion, Chavez has, in aid around the world, and I think that clearly, if he ever intended it to happen, can't happen. I don't know how much he ever thought it would actually go, but.
I'm not just there that he's already canceled a $4 billion refinery in Nicaragua.
Right, yes, he just canceled.
Found anything? I know that there was some in the Reyes documents, some talk of training of FARC operatives, surface awareness. Anything that Iran and the FARC directly go after, cut out Chavez middleman? Have you seen any sort of activity in that direction?
No, I haven't, and I've obviously looked for it. But in honesty, the FARC has maintained relationships with the Provisional IRA, with ETA, with other terrorist groups. They're clearly not reluctant to reach out for cross training and stuff. I think that one of the Colombian police are very concerned because they've said they have found Hezbollah literature and things in FARC camps. I have not seen that, but the police, much more than the military in Colombia, are deeply concerned because Hezbollah also has a long history, and I find it fascinating, and maybe people who know more about Hezbollah can explain. If the FARC got into drugs, they immediately became corrupt. Other groups get into drugs, they become massively corrupt. Hezbollah has been dealing with drugs for decades and retains its sense of, from the outside at least, it hasn't been deeply corrupted by the drug money. They've handled money and distributed it well and not let it sort of corrode their internal process, which I find a fascinating thing. But they are finding indications, what they think are real indications of more direct contacts, but nothing that I've seen myself.